Idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity characterize the way in which Dasein is its there, the disclosedness of being in the world, in an everyday way. As existential determinations, these characteristics are not objectively present in Dasein, they constitute its being. In them and in the connectedness of their being, a basic kind of the being of everydayness reveals itself, which we call the entanglement Verfallen of Dasein. This term, which does not express any negative value judgment, means that Dasein is initially and for the most part together with the world that it takes care of. This absorption in mostly has the character of being lost in the publicness of the they. As an authentic potentiality for being a self, Dasein has initially already fallen away from itself and fallen prey to the world. Falling prey to the world means being absorbed in being with one another as it is guided by idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity. What we call the inauthenticity of Dasein 13 may now be defined more precisely through the interpretation of falling prey. But inauthentic and non-authentic by no means signify, not really, eigentlich nicht, as if Dasein utterly lost its being in this kind of being. Inauthenticity does not mean anything like no longer being in the world, but rather it constitutes precisely a distinctive kind of being in the world, which is completely taken in by the world and the Dasein with of the others in the they. Not being itself functions as a positive possibility of beings, which are absorbed in a world, essentially taking care of that world. This non-being must be conceived as the kind of being of Dasein closest to it, and in which it mostly maintains itself. Thus the falling prey of Dasein must not be interpreted as a fall from a purer and higher, primordial condition. Not only do we not have any experience of this ontically, but we also do not have possibilities and guidelines for such an ontological interpretation. As factical being in the world, Dasein, falling prey, has already fallen away from itself. It has not fallen prey to some being which it does or does not run into in the course of its being, but it has fallen prey to the world which itself belongs to its being. Falling prey is an existential determination of Dasein itself, and says nothing about Dasein as something objectively present, or about present relations to beings from which it is derived, or to beings with which it has subsequently found itself in a commercium. The ontological existential structure of falling prey would also be misunderstood if we wanted to attribute to it the meaning of a bad and deplorable ontic quality, which could perhaps be removed in the advanced stages of human culture. Neither in our first reference to being in the world, as the fundamental constitution of Dasein, nor in our characterization of its constitutive structural factors, did we go beyond an analysis of the constitution of this kind of being and note its character as a phenomenon. It is true that the possible basic kinds of being in, taking care and concern, were described. But we did not discuss the question of the everyday kind of being of these ways of being. It also became evident that being in is quite different from a confrontation, gegenüberstehen, which merely observes and acts, that is, the concurrent objective presence of a subject and an object. Nevertheless, it must have seemed that being in the world functions as a rigid framework within which the possible relations of Dasein to its world occur, without the framework itself being touched upon in its kind of being. But this supposed framework itself belongs to the kind of being of Dasein. An existential mode of being in the world is documented in the phenomenon of falling prey. Idle talk discloses to Dasein a being toward its world, to others, and to itself. This being toward is such that these are understood, but in a mode of groundless floating. Curiosity discloses each and everything, but in such a way that being in is everywhere and nowhere. Ambiguity conceals nothing from the understanding of Dasein, but only in order to suppress being in the word in this uprooted everywhere and nowhere. With the ontological clarification of the kind of being of everyday being in the world discernible in these phenomena, we first gain an existentially adequate determination of the fundamental constitution of Dasein. What structure does the movement of falling prey show? Idle talk and the public interpretedness contained in it constitute themselves in being with one another. Idle talk is not objectively present for itself within the world, as a product detached from being with one another. Nor can it be volatilized to mean something universal which, since it essentially belongs to no one, really is nothing and actually only occurs in the individual Dasein that speaks. Idle talk is the kind of being with one another itself, and does not first originate through certain conditions which influence Dasein from the outside. But since, in idle talk and public interpretedness, Dasein itself presents itself with the possibility of losing itself in the they, of falling prey to groundlessness, That means that Dasein prepares for itself the constant temptation of falling prey. Being in the world is in itself tempting Verfallen. Having already become a temptation for itself in this way, the way in which things have been publicly interpreted holds fast to Dasein in its falling prey. Idle talk and ambiguity, having seen everything and having understood everything, develop the supposition that the disclosedness of Dasein thus available and prevalent could guarantee to Dasein the certainty, genuineness, and fullness of all the possibilities of its being. Self-certainty and decisiveness of the they increasingly propagate the sense that there is no need of authentic, attuned understanding. The supposition of the they that one is leading and sustaining a full and genuine life brings a reassurance Beruhigung to Dasein, for which everything is in the best order, and for whom all doors are open. Entangled being in the world, tempting itself, is at the same time tranquilizing Beruhigung. This tranquilization in inauthentic being, however, does not seduce one into stagnation and inactivity, but drives one to uninhibited busyness. Being entangled in the world does not somehow come to rest. Tempting tranquilization increases entanglement. With special regard to the interpretation of Dasein, the opinion may now arise that understanding the most foreign cultures and synthesizing them with one's own may lead to the thorough and first genuine enlightenment of Dasein about itself. Versatile curiosity and restlessly knowing it all masquerade as a universal understanding of Dasein. But fundamentally it remains undetermined and unasked what is then really to be understood, nor has it been understood that understanding itself is a potentiality for being which must become free solely in one's own Innas Dasein. When Dasein, tranquilized and understanding everything, thus compares itself with everything, it drifts toward an alienation in which its almost potentiality for being in the world is concealed. Entangled being in the world is not only tempting and tranquilizing, it is at the same time alienating. However, this alienation cannot mean that Dasein is factically torn away from itself. On the contrary, it drives Dasein into a kind of being intent upon the most exaggerated self-dissection, which tries out all kinds of possibilities of interpretation, with the result that the characterologies and typologies which it points out are themselves too numerous to grasp. Yet this alienation, which closes off to Dasein its authenticity and possibility, even if only that of genuinely getting stranded, still does not surrender it to beings which it itself is not, but forces it into its inauthenticity, into a possible kind of being of itself. The tempting and tranquilizing alienation of falling prey has its own kind of movement, with the consequence that Dasein gets tangled up Verfallen in itself. The phenomena pointed out of temptation, tranquilizing, alienation, and self-entangling, entanglement Verfallen, characterize the specific kind of being of falling prey. We call this kind of movement of Dasein in its own being the plunge absurd. Dasein plunges out of itself, into the groundlessness and nothingness of inauthentic everydayness. But this plunge remains concealed from it by the way things have been publicly interpreted, so that it is interpreted as getting ahead and living concretely, the kind of movement of plunging into and within the groundlessness of inauthentic being in that they constantly tears, understanding away from projecting authentic possibilities, and drags it into the tranquilized supposition of possessing or attaining everything. Since the understanding is thus constantly torn away from authenticity and dragged into the they, although always with a sham of authenticity, the movement of falling prey is characterized by turbulence. Not only does falling prey determine being in the world existentially, at the same time turbulence reveals the character of throwing and movement of Thrownness, which can force itself upon Dasein in its attunement. Not only is Thrownness not a finished fact, it is also not a self-contained fact. The facticity of Dasein is such that Dasein, as long as it is what it is, remains tossed about I am worth and sucked into the turbulence of the they's inauthenticity. Thrownness, in which facticity can be seen phenomenally, belongs to Dasein, which is concerned in its being about that being. Dasein exists factically. But now that falling prey has been exhibited, have we not set forth a phenomenon which directly speaks against the definition in which the formal idea of existence was indicated? Can Dasein be conceived as a being, whose being is concerned with potentiality, for being if this being has lost itself precisely in its everydayness and lives, away from itself in falling prey? Falling prey to the world is, however, phenomenal evidence against the existentiality of Dasein only if Dasein is posited as an isolated I-subject, as a self-point from which it moves away. Then the world is an object. Falling prey to the world is then reinterpreted ontologically as objective presence in the manner of inner-worldly beings. However, if we hold on to the being of Dasein in the constitution indicated of being in the world, it becomes evident that falling prey, as the kind of being of this being in, represents the most elemental proof for the existentiality of Dasein. In falling prey, nothing other than our potentiality for being enthralled is the issue, even if in the mode of inauthenticity. Dasein can fall prey only because it is concerned with understanding, attuned being in the world. On the other hand, authentic existence is nothing which hovers over entangled everydayness, but is existentially only a modified grasp of everydayness. The phenomenon of falling prey does not give something like a night view of Dasein, a property occurring ontically which might serve to round out the harmless aspect of this being. Falling prey reveals an essential, ontological structure of Dasein itself. Far from determining its nocturnal side, it constitutes all of its days in their everydayness. Our existential, ontological interpretation thus does not make any ontic statement about the corruption of human nature, not because the necessary evidence is lacking, but because its problematic is prior to any statement about corruption or incorruption. Falling prey is an ontological concept of motion. Ontically, we have not decided whether human being is drowned in sin, in the status corruptionis, or whether he walks in the status integritatis or finds himself in an interim stage, the status gratiae. But faith and worldview, when they state such and such a thing, and when they speak about Dasein as being enthralled, must come back to the existential structures set forth, provided that their statements at the same time claim to be conceptually comprehensible. The leading question of this chapter pursued the being of the there. Its theme was the ontological constitution of the disclosedness, essentially belonging to Dasein. The being of disclosedness is constituted in attunement, understanding, and discourse. Its everyday mode of being is characterized by idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity. These show the kind of movement of falling prey with the essential characteristics of temptation, tranquilization, alienation, and entanglement. With this analysis, however, the totality of the existential constitution of Dasein has been laid bare in its main features, and the phenomenal basis has been obtained for a comprehensive interpretation of the being of Dasein as care.